Hello everyone, welcome to the SAP Fiori-side chat. My name is Eugen Winchell and I'm with the SAP UX product management team, and I'm joined by my co-host Keith Fisher. Good morning, Keith.
Good morning, Eugen. How are you?
I'm good, how are you?
I'm great, thanks.
So today's topic for the Fiori-side chat is performance of SAP Fiori and SAP UI5. And for that, we have invited a great round of experts from the SAP family for a panel discussion. In today's round, we have colleagues from the technology and services units. We have with us Frederik Berg, Reshad Furunchiev, Errol Gül, Peter Müßig, and Stefan Beck. Welcome, everyone.
Hi. Thanks for having us.
Hi, Eugen.
And I'm very excited you have joined us today, and I'm really looking forward to the great conversation with all of you. And to make it truly interactive, we invite all of the attendees to actually ask questions and comment during our chat. But before we get started, we wanted to actually set a few ground rules. And over for that to Keith.
Yeah, hi everyone. So I always get to set the ground rules. So our focus is on SAP UX and UX related topics. This is not a sales session. We promise not to sell you anything, but we are interested in knowing who you are. So please go ahead and introduce yourself to the chat and have a little practice with that. We do have the ability to put people on video and microphone. And if you'd like to join, please go ahead and make sure that you click the button in the lower left of your screen and raise your hand, and we could actually put you up both on video or on audio. Please make sure that if you're not speaking that you are on mute. This is informal. We try to have a little bit of fun, and we have a large group of people with us today. So please keep everything respectful. We'll move things along, and all of these sessions are in fact recorded and available on YouTube. I wanted to also spend a moment just introducing you to the Zoom framework. So there's a chat window and a chat bubble in the middle of your Zoom window. You can go ahead and type in everything there. We have a Q&A bubble that questions and answers could be done. You can put questions in either screen. We prefer that they be in the Q&A just to help us manage and monitor things a little bit better. And that's about it. So let me go ahead and just hand it over to each one of our panelists today for introductions. So Frederik, let's start with you. Go ahead and introduce yourself.
Yeah, thanks for having me. My name is Frederik Berg. I'm head of the SAP Cloud Platform UI Technology Group. So with the team that builds UI5, launchpad, at least parts of that, and also some other UI technology that you're probably familiar with. So I'm really happy to be here today and to chat with you.
Great, thank you, Frederik. And so Reshad, go ahead and introduce yourself.
It's my pleasure. Hello, everyone. So my name is Reshad Furunchiev. I work in services organization. And we support our customers to enable and consume the Fiori products in a higher scale. And the performance is in the middle. And the group of the architects, they worldwide supporting the customers to move to the new platform.
Great, welcome, Reshad. Errol, go ahead and introduce yourself.
Yes, hi, thank you. So I'm also in a support organization like Reshad. Team lead for Fiori, and we are supporting our customers in the transition to Fiori with services like solution assessments, performance optimizations, system health checks, and so on to have a smooth transition.
That's great. Welcome, Errol. Peter, please go ahead and introduce yourself.
Hi, good morning. So my name is Peter Müßig. I'm working in the meantime as a chief architect for SAP UI5 in Frederik's organization. So I'm with UI5 since of the beginning. So it's a career of 11 years now around UI5 development, grown from a developer up now into the position of a chief architect. So a homegrown guy in that team there. So happy to be here today to join you around.
Right, welcome, Peter. And certainly last but not least, Stefan Beck. Go ahead and introduce yourself.
Okay, hi, hello. My name is Stefan Beck. I'm the Chief Product Owner of SAP UI5 and also Fiori Technology overall. And like Peter, I'm with the UI5 team from the very beginning and also part of the Fiori team. Since the very beginning, we did not yet talk about Wave 1, but it was then Fiori Wave 1 indeed. In early 2013, then followed by Fiori 2 and now Fiori 3. And yeah, performance always was also a topic that we had on our agenda and was always on our plate and important. Therefore, also very happy to have this conversation today with you.
Terrific. Welcome, Stefan. So Eugen, back over to you.
Yeah, and so before we get started, like I just launched a poll to see like who is actually attending today's session from a role perspective. And first question goes to Frederick. Frederick, performance is always like on the customer's top priority list. What is actually SAP doing to have the best possible performance? Because I know you guys do a lot. Could you share a little bit on that?
So thanks for the question. I said, and I said, referring to Stefan's answer, that yeah, it's true. Performance is obviously always, on our plate, and it's the one topic that we've always had around and always will have around. And so it's great that we can, shed some light on how we look at the topic really, and how we also hopefully today can sort of structure it into the different components that we look at when we talk about performance, right? So obviously, when you look at a product from a customer point of view, when you are, for example, using an S/4HANA cloud product or so, you're looking at the product from the outside perspective. You first of all, see the Fiori launchpad and that performance. The launchpad is obviously built using UI5 technology. So I think today we can also talk a bit about what we've done in the past, roughly 2 years now, to take some of the things that we did inside of the UI5 core framework to enable the launchpad to have a much better performance than what you saw a few years back, right? So that's, I think, one of the areas that we should talk about today. And then there's this entire spectrum of things we do in order to make sure that application performance as such is great, right? And so we've also invested now for several years a lot into that topic in particular, right? We call this session today Performance and Modularization. I think it's a really good fit, because modularizing the stack that we have, being able to serve less code to the client, is sort of what we try to achieve. So I think today we hopefully can dig in a bit deeper and explain to you what really we did in much more detail.
Great. And Richard, from a customer perspective, when is actually the right time to think about performance?
So actually, the performance is the topic where you should really include it from the very beginning of your project. It's just when you start thinking about the performance at the test phase, it's really late. So every time when we visit the customers, we look at the project plan, and we're really trying to see if they have planned this from the design phase, all the business process, and they included non-productive requirements, also performance KPIs, because the right filtering, right user groups, right authorization, the scope of Fiori implementation is the key factors to be successful at the end. And therefore, it has to be planned at the very beginning. However, still, you should really also not forget during the upgrade phase, or when you roll out new users, you really need to make sure that the system really is prepared and configured properly to really carry the volume of these new users, and this will also make risk your performance aspects. Therefore, the performance has to be always on your radar, and if you do so, you will be always fit, and it will always work. And if it doesn't, then we have always the team of experts and a lot of knowledge bases that really points you to the right recommendations how to avoid risks.
So you just mentioned like a lot of planning required. So what are actually considerations for planning that you would recommend?
So I like this question, because this is a paradigm of user experience itself, because what happens usually, we don't consider one single step usually as a performance, but you really need to think about the business user, and the business user works with the business process itself end to end. So important is the person who works with the transaction or the interface has to complete the certain function in a certain a certain amount of time. So what we do is in this planning is like we are trying to achieve the business process to understanding, or guide them to understand the business process end to end, how it will be used, right? And to see if it's executed in time. And this is the key criteria. And may happen that 1 or 2 steps will take longer, but in case if you just load the historical data for 10 years in the history, that is possible with the HANA, then this may take 5 seconds, right? But other steps may take half a second. But doesn't make any sense to say the performance suddenly became wrong, because if you end to end in the business process for 20 seconds, you still can fulfill your business need, business role, and it will work very well for you. So therefore, planning means a business process and end-to-end time for executing the business function. This is for me the key, right?
Thanks. And Errol, you mentioned like you are working very closely with customers. Are there any best practices that you have seen that you would recommend, so to say, to do?
Yeah, I mean, especially in Fiori, we have different aspects we need to consider, like, of course, from the design phase, like how do I design my Fiori launchpad up to the system point of view? Are the caches activated? Do we have the right capacity from hardware point of view? So there are really many aspects. But usually what we or what I face at customers often like the wrong design of the Fiori launchpad. So they want to have all the applications in the Fiori launchpad activated. And there we're always trying to motivate also our customers or the implementation partner to rethink the plan they have. So to reduce the number of applications shown in the Fiori launchpad, and also in reducing the volume to have a better performance, for example.
Okay, that's very good. And Peter, you mentioned like you've been with the team for now more than 10 years, actually 11 years. What other documentation exists that you actually help guide customers and partners through this process?
So we, from a technology perspective, so we write more the documentation on the UI5 side, so on the application side, what things you need to consider if you develop the application. And it starts really in the small parts already, that you need to make the things right. So if the app is built in a small piece wrong, in a bigger system, this all accumulates, and then you come to a bad performance figure at all. So it's really, really essential that everyone in his apps is taking care to do and look into the performance. And this is what the team has done. So over the last 2 years, we invested significantly also in a project called UI5 Evolution. It's about the modernization of our framework, thinking about a direction to be async. So means that we try to get rid of synchronous requests, what we had in the past, and make this or remove this as kind of official APIs, what we have in our code base, and also things about modularization, what Frederick mentioned. This was also one key part what we did and looked into to make it possible to only use fine granular pieces of the UI5 framework instead of the big monolith. There are other things like what we are looking into this progressive loading behavior of applications, that we can support app developers with proper APIs to structure and orchestrate the code a bit more in a way that apps can step by step build up their applications instead of doing a one-time blob once everything is there, which improves at the end the perceived performance. And this is also one of the key figures at all, to get that. And another part of that, what we are looking to, is more on the standalone case when it comes to single application usage, that we also improve the tooling, that you can also come up with bundling. Especially when you do things for mobile devices, this is essential, that you can come to smaller bundles which allow optimal performance for these applications, the UI5 applications at all. So we from the UI5 perspective, we really support from the foundation level all the upper level services like the Fiori launchpad and so on, to make the overall experience running and to enable them also to benefit from all the improvements what we do here.
Let me maybe quickly jump in from my perspective, because I have also something to add to what Peter said and to what Errol said. There's one interesting slide that I quickly would like to share with you regarding the Fiori launchpad. What you can really see here, 17.11 means our cloud release. This translates into November 2017. We had the Fiori launchpad startup time around 6.5 seconds to 4.7 seconds. And here you also see the difference between the lines is the number of tiles that you have configured for an end user. That means the top curve has more tiles than the orange curve. And now you can see nicely how we improved the out-of-the-box performance of the Fiori launchpad. And then around end of last year and beginning of this year, we have it around 1.5 seconds stable. What is also important, because it relates to what Errol said, in the beginning we had the clear guidance, consider the number of tiles, because there was a huge impact on the number of tiles with the performance. But you can see now with the technology optimizations and what Peter said, that performance now does not very much depend on the number of tiles. So in this regard, with standard tiles launching applications, we helped you, and you have to care less than in the past. Now, what is really important, and what I would also like to point to, we still have tiles like smart business KPI tiles that do a lot of analytics below the hood, although they just show a figure or a small chart. But calculating this chart can be still expensive. And if you put such a calculation or tile on the launchpad in Monday morning situations when caches are empty, a lot of users start such tiles. Therefore, still, please be careful with the number of KPI tiles, the smart business tiles that you put on the launchpad, at least on the first pages. However, with regards to just standard tiles launching an app, we helped you very much. And as you can see also nicely here, the performance significantly improved. That means in upgrading to already available technology versions of UI5, being the front-end server 6.0 and UI5 version 1.71, or to the later S/4HANA products, you really get this performance out of the box with already a significant improvement.
What really should add here is also, if you brought that up, Stefan, with the smart business tiles, and from a technical perspective, what's happening, I just want to add that as a technical guy here, that's really like starting a UI5 application. So it's not like just a tile presenting a figure. So it's really technically completely a UI5 application, which is being started. And you can imagine if this is done for 10, 20 tiles, this is really massive, loading, a massive loading time, which is spent on all that.
So Peter, that's it's a good segue to, what the customer or end user's perspective is of performance. So, we've shown a graph here around the Fiori launchpad and a certain finite set of tiles for each type of persona. But how does the end user perceive performance? What kind of metrics exist for SAP in how they measure performance as well, all the way from the from the back end all the way up to to what the end user actually sees? Do we have any kind of metrics on that? Something you could show?
Yeah, basically we have something like this. I think, Frederick, we have prepared this Fiori launchpad animation. I think should we? Yeah, I think we can present.
I think this is something we should talk about, because it nicely fits into what we just saw, and also relates a bit to a statement I heard before. I think it was Reshad who said that when you look at a business process and some scenarios where it's all about what the end user really expects from a screen at a certain point in time, right? And so maybe if we can bring up that slide, we can talk a bit about some of also the thoughts related to this UI5 evolution project and how we translated this into a different way of actually looking at performance, right? Because let's say even within SAP until a while back, when you look at performance KPIs, what we really did was just look at, let's say, when a URL was entered into the browser until basically the CPU of the client machine with the browser running didn't do anything anymore, right? So when all of the workload was finished, that's when we considered the step to be over, right? In reality, it's not really like that, or it's not that relevant usually. An end user looking at a screen, will go, if you look at the screen now, will go from the left-hand side where he actually has a launchpad, clicks on a tile, to the right-hand side of the screen, which has lots of content, displayed. It doesn't happen in one stop, right? There's a movement, there's a transition. So, Peter, if you forward one or two slides, what we try to talk about now is, yeah, exactly. This is great. Yeah. Well, we try to educate not just internal folks within SAP, but also, at conferences and stuff, also customers and partners, was that this really is a flow, right? If you look at this first empty page, basically, that says first paint, What's really important here is that, you know, the system, when you do something, actually brings back some content right away, right? So that it feels active, it feels fast, right? This is what we mean by perceived performance, right? If the system takes 5 seconds to show this first paint screen, that's not good. If it takes 500 milliseconds, the system feels very responsive, right? So this is one of the things we worked on to get this first paint to be there at a very early point in time. Now, as a next step, you see a screen that is somewhat laid out already. So you have the notion of content areas coming in. There's not a lot on the screen yet, right? The most important next step is then when we have something called the first meaningful paint. This is when you have basically text that shows up on the screen, because it's meaningful in a way that an end user can now start to orientate himself, right? So he can look for content that he would like to consume next, right? It could be another tile that he wants to click on or something to interact with. So he's scanning the screen already at this point in time. Now, as you move forward on the time axis, right, the next really critical point in time, and that's what usually people are waiting for if they want to just navigate through a system, is when does the system become interactive, right? And interactivity in this case means you can click, the system will react to the click and navigate you to maybe the next step, open details, or do something like that. And it was done differently in the Launchpad a while back, where we basically loaded everything that the Launchpad needed in terms of code and features, let's say in parallel to this critical path for an end user, right? So sometimes a plugin that was loaded was slowing down on, you know, this moment of time that we call interactive here, which is not what you should do, right? So we turned this around, and now we try to really concentrate on bringing up what's most important first and loading, let's say, less important code in the think time of the user when he's looking at the screen, reading, scrolling, and doing these things, right? And that already helped a lot, right? To bring down this feeling of sluggishness a bit and really help to speed up this perceived performance and actually real loading performance too. I think we even have an example, right, Peter? There we can just show.
It's the video here. Hold on the left-hand side and right on the new one.
Exactly, so and if you look at this, you'll see how, let's say, the top header of the screen comes up very fast, and then maybe we'll explain what to look for, and then you do it again. But the background comes in right away. The tiles are there much earlier, and it's the same sort of functionality. But we, as I said, we offloaded all of the unnecessary code loading to a later point in time and try to optimize also the usage of CSS, for example, to be in line with the page quickly and at the very start of the page loading process.
Yeah. So are they best practices established here for people who are, who are planning or, putting many analytical apps onto a Launchpad? I mean, it sounds like this is a good structure to bring things in, but do you have any other recommendations or best practices there?
So, I mean, just to maybe to go back one step to what we actually saw right here. This is happening, as Stefan said, this is happening out of the box, right? This is sort of what's been built in by the teams of the Fiori Launchpad UI and UI5, in cooperation, trying to optimize the loading that we see. So this affects every rendering of this homepage, right? And this is what's already available in the products that you can use today, right? And maybe we can, bring back Stefan also talking about maybe this loading of analytical content and what that means for a Launchpad, for example, a bit more, because that's a different thing, as Peter already said. That's sort of once the initial layout is there, then it's about how easily can you render these tiles, or how complicated these tiles actually are, how much data do they request from the underlying systems, right?
Yeah, as that coming a bit to the analytical content, there are obviously two sides of the medal. One is what we would call traditionally, if we mean performance, is somehow the startup time. But the second aspect that must not be neglected is the scalability of your system. Even although if the performance might be okay for one of the users, they might slow down the systems for all others. So this is definitely something that must be considered. And as we have explained and Frederic explained, we have taken a lot of let's say, the performance relevant figures of the critical path when starting the FLP. And if you now watch the FLP by the later REST4 systems on premise and cloud, there was a question. So for both of them, you will realize that also the smart business KPI tiles appear immediately, but then the charts, they are, let's say, shown with a delay. And the good thing is they appear immediately. And this is then an important point in time to enable the interactiveness of the application. As soon as the tile is visible, even without the KPI that is shown, you can directly click and navigate. And if you know what you do with the application, you can just move ahead. And this is somehow from the performance perspective important. However, if you don't navigate away directly, your data calls are sent to the backend systems. And if these backend systems do, let's say, queries to the database, this obviously influences the scalability of the systems. And therefore, there is a certain impact. And now it's also guidance that we give to, let's say, the internal developers, but it's also important for you at customer side. If you develop KPI tiles and smart business tiles, there's a nice documentation that you should switch on, or ideally switch on the HANA result cache. That means you can mark your CDS view, yet you should define as cacheable, and ideally also double check whether this is working before you release such a KPI tile, because sometimes there are authorization checks that do joins and whatever that, let's say, prevent the HANA result cache from working. Therefore, let's say as a general guideline, it's really important that you, if you build such things, go for caching, go for cacheable CDS views, and also validate that caching is working. There are tools provided by SAP and HANA that you can double check and see are it really cache hits, and only if things are positive and somehow kind of benchmarks are reached, then you also should release such CDS views and tiles into your productive environment. So that is really important. So if you build something, educate your people, be it the UI5 application developer, be the service developer, please open the respective tools, have a look into it, be it the backend tracing tools, being profiling tools in Chrome. That is really important. And our guideline on top of the rules also really make that the people are caring about the performance, and that's also a learning curve that we had at SAP. First, you have to build, it's new technology. You are happy if things are working at all. However, performance will get you sooner or later. So better you look into it sooner than later.
Right. So, and this is a good time to weave in a couple of questions from the audience. So I think first from Sagar, he was saying with global deployment, it's important to keep network in mind for reference for performance. There's a note for Fiori network bandwidth requirements. Are there any other things that we customers or partners should consider?
Good. It's from my side. What is somehow what means in the sense of real regulations or rules or hard rules. I think it's more or less bandwidth. The CPU power of the machines of the client desktops is also very much relevant. Obviously, there's no hard guideline in that sense, but the faster the CPU on the client machines are, the better the performance is. And also what we saw lately, it's also important to take care about the browsers. So if we look into the past, the browser matters, and also the version of the browser matters. And what we observe is that the browsers really are usually getting faster. And there's also now, for instance, one of the really critical ones. I know that the Internet Explorer 11 is widely used at customer side. This is also kind of a problem. let's say Edge Chromium or Firefox Chrome, all of them would in the average be, let's say, close as twice as fast as the Internet Explorer. Therefore, also consider the browser strategy in your company. Is it really potentially possible for the standard applications to go for a new browser and maybe isolate your really old legacy apps and only start them in the i11? That's things that you have to consider that definitely also help to get the best possible user experience to your customers.
Also, there is one thing what we should add as well, as we have recently learned about that. So also keep up to date, keep your browsers up to date. This is also one thing we had. So there were some customer, or was a customer, who recently brought us some information. They were, due to a device lock, limited to Chrome 55, and have recently updated to Chrome 83. And this overall also improved the performance for about 40% on the mobile device, which is massive. So this is also really a thing which you should keep in mind to also keep your browser up to date.
So Errol, from your perspective, do you have any other kind of related recommendations here?
Yeah, of course, yeah. So on the UI layer, it's mainly really important to have the caching in the browser, yeah, so that the UI resources are not loaded through all over the world. And the only bottleneck we have here, it's really the data which is transferred, yeah, from the system to the application. And there really the recommendation to not create so big OData services, which is then consumed by the Fiori application. Instead, having really small, lightweight OData services, which fits to the UIs and only load the data which is needed in the UI. So everything else is not is unnecessary and will also have effects on the performance.
These 2 points are really interesting, especially the first point about the caching. So the caching of UI assets. So keep in mind to use when you are in the cloud, to use CDN services for that. This helps you to get the UI assets much faster. So UI5 is, for example, distributed via the Akamai network and is much better available than on any place around the world. With that. So this is one option. And one other thing I would also add as a remark to that, what you said to the services, which is really true. So avoid big services, but also avoid many services. We also saw in the past in several performance escalations, the problem that one app used 5-10 OData services. So this at the end turned out to be a massive load of these metadata calls in the beginning when the app starts, and so this should really also be avoided. So the best is you build one app, one service, or at least try to reduce it as much as you can to really avoid these data requests.
So Peter,
I also,
sorry, go ahead, guys.
So let me quickly send also Errol. Thanks. So I think you also should differentiate between the performance in LAN and wide area network, right? Because once you go outside of your company and let your business users access the system and they're accessing from the different regions, of course, there's different network components and technologies help to speed up. But what we have observed also that the customers and especially the end users, they complain, but they don't know what they're complaining about. And then you have to be very precise and understand from which part of the internet or the network the request is coming and optimize the right component, because it really clarifies the confusion in some extent. Because one user says it's 1 second, another says it's 2 seconds, and then who is right? Maybe both are right? And make a structure and categorize the complaints or concerns or wishes. Errol, sorry, you?
Yeah, maybe also a small point to add here. So also what I'm referring always in this discussion is really the Fiori design principles. So like Peter said, to have one OData service for one application. So the Fiori design principles, of course, first of all, there are design guidelines, but if you follow them, it will also have effect on the technical layer below. So if you have small applications for small use cases. So this will also, of course, affect the technical performance below. So design guidelines, yes, but it really has also effects on the technical performance.
Okay, cool. You guys mentioned OData services quite a few times. There was a question from the audience that said, like, are there any plans to support REST services as well?
It's now also a bit tricky question. Maybe the author can also specify it in more in detail. What is definitely possible right now, you can directly use other services as of UI5 since years. So there are other models, and you can basically call any REST service. The question is now, what kind of automatism do you expect on top of these services? Right. What kind of data binding and structural support you expect? And here, I think it's the difference. But let's say in principle, the statement is that any kind of REST service is supported. But Peter, you can, I see you are eager to answer quickly. So
no. Yeah, no, not eager to answer quickly, but I want to add some few things because yeah, supporting REST services all is something. Yeah, we can load data from REST services. Yeah, you can use a JSON model. It's very primitive at the end, and then it gets the data if it's JSON based and put it into this model, and you can bind to that. But I think the most important part about the REST is that depending on what kind of REST server you are using, it's not specified. It's not everywhere the same thing. How paging works, how sorting, filtering works. It depends on the backend how this is being implemented. So this is a bit more tricky compared to that what OData is, which is an extension of the REST protocol and standardize all these parts. So there it was more easier from a framework perspective to build something like a model. But definitely, yeah, the JSON model is really primitive. And one thing what we are really lacking here is to explain a bit more in detail how model implementations are working, how you can build own bindings and stuff like that on top of that to consume your kind of REST service. So also best practices on that. Okay. This is not part.
So talking about best practices, there was a question, which is the best browser for Fiori? You talked about so many different ones that are available in the market. Which is the best that you would recommend?
It's a hard thing and not sure what we allowed from SAP to do. What shall I say? Let's say neutrally, the fastest one these days is Chrome. I think that is what the measurements show. However, there's now from Microsoft the Edge on Chromium version. And from my side, this is a very interesting browser for many SAP customers because it has still an i11 mode. That means if you deploy this browser, you have still a configuration way for your legacy software running in i11 mode and use the Chromium plugin with the same performance than the Chrome browser, because in fact it is the same for the modern Fiori application. So I think Edge Chromium is something that I consider for many SAP customers with legal, let's say, or older or legal requirements towards i11 as a quite interesting one. But besides that, in principle, all others are supported on our PAM, and so to speak, the customer is free to choice. But I think the fastest one is clear, and also I think the one that is maybe most suited for businesses with legal requirement might be the Edge Chrome.
That's true. Maybe let me add to this one quickly, because there's also, and this is, I think, mostly true, obviously, for desktop devices, right? When you talk about mobile, the market is a bit different. And this is kind of, interesting because we talked about mobile performance a few years back when we were faced, not just within SAP, but also externally, with a problem that a large web application sort of showed a very, erratic loading behavior across different device types. And one thing to understand in terms of performance is that JavaScript performance mostly on devices only uses one CPU core, right, to execute and to pass and to process all of that JavaScript. So we saw that when you have, let's say, an Apple iOS device, they usually have fewer cores, but very powerful ones, right? So we saw a better performance on these devices for mobile applications just because the JavaScript processing on a single threaded CPU just worked, relatively better, where native mobile devices would on a Google device, for example, just use many of the cores available for native processing, but fell back when it came to mobile JavaScript processing. So that's kind of what's been true all along, and that's one of the reasons why we ultimately decided to build tools and technologies to reduce the amount of code that we need to process on the client overall, right? Because that's very important. I mean, the more code you throw at the browser, the longer it will effectively take, and that's especially true for weak mobile devices with limited CPU core power, right? So that's why I think on the mobile device landscape, it's even a different challenge, right, altogether, right, in order to optimize this.
So, Frederick,
to add a question in there for the audience, I mean, around performance, and you're speaking about mobile devices, how important is memory actually in the consideration of performance for the laptop or the smartphone?
I wouldn't say that it's crucial, let's say. I mean, for all of the, bottleneck situations that we've encountered in the past, it's not so much about memory, right? At a certain point, it can become a problem, obviously, if it's very limited, but usually it's really the CPU performance that's much more critical, and that's what you really need to pay attention to. Maybe Peter has some other insights as well. But
yeah, I don't have figures now at the end, but I think the memory is not our biggest problem. So the CPU power is more essential, and overall, for sure, this bandwidth, latency, and reducing the size of UI5 or of the Fiori apps at the end, this is the most important part to get really up to the performance. So these are the points here. I think the memory, so in the early days of UI5 or Phoenix, whatever the project was called in the beginning, it was really a point with the memory that we looked into that. We had also memory leak issues, and then it came up and accumulated at the end, the memory, and then it exploded. Yeah, but this is a long time ago. So the memory was not really an issue the last years.
But maybe let's also comment one thing, and maybe we can drill into one of the details there as well. If you look at how a browser works and what usually goes wrong when somebody complains about a catastrophic performance, right? I mean, when we talk about situations where an application takes 40 seconds to load, we're not talking about CPU issues or memory issues like that, right? That's a totally different ballpark, really, right? What's usually going wrong there is the number of requests that are happening and the latency of the network in between, right? Because when you have such a situation, I worked on one of these cases a few years back where customers experienced a 500 millisecond latency for each HTTP call. And they had misconfigured an application loading to take almost 200 such requests, right? So that's 200 times 500 milliseconds. And that ultimately was, fixed by a number of things. Akamai, Peter mentioned it before, but also making sure that the number of requests is just drastically reduced, right? The app ultimately loaded in less than 2 seconds, right? Coming down from 2 minutes. I mean, it's crazy, but sometimes we have these situations, and then it's just very important to understand the network principles and basics of what's really happening. It's also what Stefan said, be sort of aware of what's happening in your system, right? Being able to read a trace in Chrome, for example, will already tell you what, in these, catastrophic situations, as I said, what's really going wrong, right?
I also want to add here one point. So during our services, we had, or I delivered even personally the last 4 or 5 years in performance optimizations. I would say maybe 95% of the performance issues I saw in the applications was really based in the system. So really long running or data requests. And on the SAP UI5, that really it was, I don't know, maybe 1-2 times in the performance optimization service we delivered. So it's really, like I said, Frederick.
So there was a question I mean, we touched the network speed topic quite a bit. Are there any documents, best practices that you can share with the audience that you have already available somewhere?
So Definitely on the UI5 side, especially on this foundation layer. Sorry, the printer is now running in the back. I hope it's not disturbing so much. So we have really produced a lot of material over the last years. So just to show a few of them. So we really produced in the beginning, so a while back, even in 2017, after one thing we noticed that many people misconfigure UI5 applications or forget to do preload builds and stuff like that, that we wrote together what all you need to take care of and look into if you build really your UI5 application. And most of them, they are part of documentation and they are part of the UI5 bus, which is something in the SAP community network, a special tag what we are using to expose our material. And here we also had recently also wrote a bit more stuff. So after the UI5Con in 2019, we spent also more in building up this performance checklist for UI5 apps. And this is something really the developers should really take care of. So I have it here open. Maybe this one I can immediately put you in the chat after I present it, and then you can also take a look directly after that. So it's really about looking into the performance of a UI5 app from a developer perspective. We have a tool called Support Assistant you can open on an app. You can run checks on the app. It will give you some information whether the preload configuration is properly means the dependencies to the application to the libraries of UI5 you are using are properly maintained in the app. And it also explains step by step if you are doing your own bootstrap, how to do that. If you are in your component that you need to take care of configuring the root view async or the routing should run in an async mode. So all this stuff needs to be configured then in the app to really benefit from all this asynchronous nature, what we have implemented over the last year into the framework to benefit from that. So, and ideally you are also running, this is one thing maybe we also missed on one point, what you should also look into, that your application or that your system, your FLP and your applications are running fast, is to also get up to speed and up to date with the UI5 versions ideally. So 171, which is the current long-term support, has already many of the performance improvements implemented, and you can benefit of that then for your application development with that. So there are a lot of things what we have changed in the framework with APIs perspective, what developers can look into to really use asynchronous APIs to do stuff, then our refactoring of modules, so and so on. So it's some stuff to read. And also here with respect to OData, there are also some hints in. So for example, doing preloads means that if your component, your UI5 application starts, then the metadata will be already loaded during the time when your application is also preloaded. So it saves some time later and uses the lazy time when loading the application to also preload the metadata and so stuff like that.
So I had a question related to this, and it kind of relates a little bit to what Stefan said a little bit earlier, right? As a developer, you're just overjoyed once you get something to actually come up properly, that you get data, and you're often running these applications in a very localized and limited manner. Mm-hmm. How can developers get ahead of the performance related questions as early as possible? Because it seems like if I was a developer, as I used to be, my goal would to get it run and then have somebody else test it, right? And to the point of getting these things ingrained in the mindset of the developers early, what is it that we can remind customers and developers to do?
So also a few of these checks, what you have seen in the support assistant in the beginning of that document, they can also be run on a local execution when you are developing, let's say in the web IDE or so. You can run that and you can get already then some early feedback, like you need to maintain your dependencies properly in the manifest, or you can enable the preload for the data source and stuff like that for the OData. All this, these are available already beforehand, but at the end, if you deploy, then if you deploy from Web IDE perspective at the end, you will get automatically a preload being generated for your application, so you do not need to take care of. In the past, this was easier to also do that and do a deployment without doing a preload build. And in these cases, we had often this experience that there was a performance issue with that. Because of this single request what Frederick mentioned, and all the single requests they at the end were synchronously. So yeah, this stuff is partially solved by tooling support, partially you should also use and learn about all these tools what we have around, and maybe also take time to read this checklist here to get an understanding of all these things what we have achieved around.
So speaking of tools, then there are a couple of questions.
May I
yes,
add
sure.
one more important aspect of it? Peter very well said. What we need also to add on top of it, you really need to have representative business data where you test your application. Because what happens is sometimes in development environment, you don't have enough data to identify performance risks, right? So you really need to sit on the representative data and then test it.
Yeah, mass data test is something which is not very common in development, and once it goes live, then it's a different, different thing. Yeah, depends on how the user interface at the end looks like. So if you are using proper caching, proper paging mechanisms, especially for mass data, like using the UI5, the table controls and stuff like that, and your data, you get already support for doing this paging, but it depends also on how the user interface is built and how far it is moving away from standards. Means from that patterns, what we by default provide, like for example with Fiori elements and stuff like that, or with these concepts that it goes away into a manual crafted user interface where maybe the paging is not active and it doesn't prevent from loading too much data then.
So yeah, speaking of Fiori,
Keith, so it definitely makes sense, as said, to look into realistic test data. That's very important. However, to add what Peter said, it is, as per our observation, the more important task for the service developer. Usually, as said, the UI5 controls, tables, Fiori elements with paging, all the stuff, usually the service really gets a, let's say, erratic performance from really slow response time. The UI usually gets a bit faster, but not too much. So really, yes, please do it. Also, please educate the service developer to do it, because the service usually reacts more to, let's say, if it's wrongly programmed to the performance aspect, if the data grows.
Right, and so yeah, thank you for that elaboration. So speaking of Fiori elements, right, I think that there are a couple questions in the Q&A around the benefits or any additional considerations of Fiori elements, right? Does using Fiori elements establish best practices, you know, and give them for free, if you will, by the usage of that tool, or are there other considerations that should be done?
Yeah. So basically, let me start. Fiori elements, you have different flavors of using Fiori elements. Let's assume a pure Fiori elements application. That means the service developer develop an OData service. Then you go into the Business Application Studio or Web IDE and configure your application without writing any line of code. Then definitely Fiori element takes care about the performance aspects on the client completely. And also to give you an example, so what we observe with the later software versions is then in the Fiori launchpad, it's for an easy Fiori element, it's below 1 second the startup performance. So for a list report, you can, it's 0.8 seconds what you can achieve roughly, to give you a kind of benchmark. If the application is more complex, it might be 1.3, 1.4 seconds. So that's kind of realistic with Fiori elements. And now it's this to carefully a few extensions, because usually if you work with Fiori elements, you also program extensions. And if you do, and you work on the extension, you then really have to compare how much is now the performance influence. Because if you have an application with 0.8 seconds, then you add a breakout and then you end up with 3 seconds, then most likely you have done something wrong, right? So Therefore, observe what you are doing. If you go into the extension story, then also here you have to take care that you do not break the optimizations that have built into the Fiori elements. But in principle, Fiori element supports you a lot in doing stuff right. Let's formulate it in that way.
Okay. Any other comments on Fiori elements? I mean, I think there are other questions in the chat about whether or not the evolution of Fiori elements will continue to to handle more and more use cases here around the launchpad and the rest. I'm not sure if you have any perspectives on that.
Good. I think from our perspective, the Fiori elements and UI5 are in principle both really very valid options. From SAP perspective, how we look at it, so Fiori element has a big advantage. It's kind of guarantees that similar development teams come to similar results. And so this is, if you build an application suite, a very important quality. And it's also very important as SAP builds thousands of applications. It's really important to have them consistent. And also, if we now, we introduced Fiori 2, now we go to Fiori 3, there might also be design changes in the future. And using Fiori element, we can apply, let's say, this design changes without the application developer touching the code again and again. So there are certain advantages if you scale the software development and build many apps. However, there's nothing wrong to optimize or to build a freestyle applications for dedicated use cases that makes much sense, and your designers think, hey, here the Fiori element is not the right or does not deliver the right pattern, then build it on your own, that it's completely fine too. So it's a kind of a thing where we add comfortable and efficient programming as a way to reduce also not only the development cost, but also, let's say, the
maintenance cost,
end-to-end support costs, update costs, whatever. So this is somehow an offering, but as said, it depends on the use case, what makes sense for which part. And maybe last statement before I give back to you, from a product direction, we want to also break down the boundary between Fiori element and freestyle. So also we want to enable a freestyle developer to use subsets of a Fiori element pattern in his application, and vice versa. We work on opening Fiori elements to bring freestyle UI5 artifacts in it. So let's say that we remove this hard boundary and that it's a kind of a toolbox that you can leverage and take what fits best. So that you have best of both worlds, so to speak, sorry.
So are we doing more on the things like the Fiori elements overview page to make it richer, more simple, to make it look a lot like SAP Analytic Cloud? And there was also a comment in there that the Analytic Cloud seems to act differently, render differently, and what are the differences there? So are we doing more to be in the overview pages and analytic apps to be more like SAC, and and how are they different? And that's a pretty open question there. I'll throw out there and to the panel who would like to answer.
Good, it's a bit a tricky question to be answered. So let's first start. We understand fully why this question was asked. However, I think one of the last session was exactly Fiori 3 and the intelligent enterprise, that SAP strives to unify the experience and to bring, let's say, all products closer together. And this very much applies also here. Yes, we are working on that path, that things fit together and under the umbrella of the Fiori 3 design, then also have the same user experience.
A very good politically correct answer.
No, but in fact, it's what we do. I was all thinking about what details can be shared, but it's definitely, it was not just kidding. It was
so maybe another question on the versions of UI5. Can the latest version of SAP UI5 be used in the backend version that is older?
Usually the Fiori front-end server is the term that is used by customers and partners. That means the UI5 version goes hand in hand with the Fiori launchpad back-end part, but still on the front-end server. And I'm not sure how the question is meant. So if you see UI5 and Fiori launchpad as one unit, then yes, this combination can work against older backends. Then it's right. However, to just update UI5 and not update the Fiori launchpad backend part, this is not possible.
Okay. And then, Errol, you mentioned something around the OData service, that one single OData service is better than multiple ones. There's a question, so does a single OData service offer better performance compared to multiple OData services for a single application?
Yeah, I think first of all, the concept to have one OData service for one Fiori application is not really performance related. So it's more to have the independent applications. But of course, as more OData services you need to initiate in your application, as long as it will take. So there would be the recommendation to have then one OData service.
Let me quickly add to that one. That's also a thing that we have observed. Same applies for smart business KPI tiles or analytical stuff. That because it's so easy, people tend to reuse a service and do not really get the best performance out of it. So just reusing a Fiori OData service that was built for an application and add it to a tile is maybe not, in most cases, I think it will not be best practice because there's a lot of overhead in doing that. And if you make use of such a service for a tile, especially on a homepage that every user hits, also here, it's really important that you optimize your data service and really build a dedicated one, really optimized for this usage.
Okay. Because we talked about OData again, when do we have full OData version 4 support by the by the S/4HANA ABAP stack and the UI5 controls?
Goodie. We now, let's say, where are we now? We are now at a stage where I would say we have now decent support where you can start. However, also be frank and open here. I think we even, let's say, received in hard times in our company also new people that we accelerate still the development on the V2 stack. Therefore, we have kind of a, in the positive sense, a moving target that still there's a strong development in V2 and the V4 stack also has a strong and even stronger invest. However, as we have a moving target, it's a bit tricky to say when we completely catch up. Therefore, I think I would phrase the question in a different way. So please look it into a way, does the V4 stack already give me the capabilities that I need? And even you get some capabilities that are more advanced because the V2 stack can technically not do it, then please go as soon as possible to V4 as the preferred direction. So the investment will be higher in V4. However, if things really are missing, it's also not wrong to stick to the the V2 stack as we continue to maintain it, and there's also still an ongoing investment. So really look into what features you need and not in the sense of what is really complete. In that sense, I can also say both stacks are not complete and evolve further.
There's actually a question. I don't know if you guys can actually answer that, but I'll still ask you. A customer is asking me about SAP support for Kubernetes and more specifically about Kaima. Is this something anybody can help with this one from this audience?
So I guess that,
yeah, go ahead.
So I guess in this round, maybe this is the question is not for the different group, but from the services perspective, from the consulting perspective, surely there is a support and consultants expertise in these areas, so it can be supported as well.
Yeah.
Right? And there are even some knowledge bases, but they should be really a special case or special question to be searched in the knowledge bases and best practices that exist. And the best also on the case, as we already in support have seen some customers that really go into the hyperscalers and they rebuild their landscape or innovate in the area of Kubernetes. They also go into the design phase and then ask particular questions. So this is more consulting-like of support, what the organization can offer for a customer and for projects.
Thank you, Rishad. Okay, so then I think we are quite a bit over time. You saw like there was a lot of questions from the audience. First of all, thanks a lot for everybody who asked the question, and I hope we could answer all of your questions in the way form that addressed your question. Big thank you to all of you from the panel. Thanks for joining today. This was really a great conversation. And knowing of how interactive it was today, I bet we will see you again in one of the next Fiori-side chats. So if you're interested in any of the previous sessions or in any of the future sessions, we actually have a URL, the tiny URL link with tinyurl.com/sap-fiori-side-chat. You find all the recordings from the previous sessions as well as the agenda for the next sessions and all the required login information as well. And with that, really big thank you again to the panelists, and Keith, thanks for co-hosting, and see you anytime soon.